Victoria Ashbourne crossed the threshold of the harvest basket, like a diamond-edged blade slicing through burlap, the automatic doors hissing behind her like a sharp intake of breath. She didn't merely enter. She occupied the space, her presence instantly demanding a higher standard from the air itself. Her eyes, cool and analytical, bypassed the organic displays and artisan breads, locking instead onto the one visual discordance that threatened her internal sense of symmetry. It wasn't the smudged glass of the deli case or the faint hum of a struggling refrigerator. It was the cashier's posture. As Lena Morales dragged a carton of milk across the scanner, Victoria's gaze narrowed on the girl's trembling, ink-stained fingers. To Victoria, that tremor wasn't just fatigue. It was a lack of mental fortitude. She viewed struggle as a symptom of a weak will, and before she had even placed her designer tote on the belt, she had already diagnosed Lena's entire life as a series of poor decisions. The sensor at the entrance gave a polite, electronic beep that seemed to offend the quiet dignity of Victoria's tailored navy suit. She stepped onto the dull linoleum, her stiletto heels striking the floor with a staccato, militaristic rhythm that cut through the soft background music of the grocery store. To the weary shoppers clutching their coupons, she appeared less like a neighbor and more like a celestial visitor from a world of sterile boardrooms and private jets. The harsh overhead fluorescent lights, usually unforgiving, seemed to recoil from her, catching the high-wattage glint of her sapphire earrings and making her glow with a cold, intimidating perfection. She didn't proceed to the aisle immediately. She stood for a moment, her posture a column of unwavering iron as she surveyed the scene. Her nostrils flared slightly at the scent of overripe produce and industrial disinfectant. A thin line of disdain formed between her perfectly shaped brows as she appraised the store's efficiency. To Victoria, the world was a ledger of assets and liabilities, and this register lane was deep in the red. She saw the overdue stamps on the papers tucked messily by the register. She saw the small, taped-up photograph of 3 children that she dismissed as an unprofessional distraction, and she saw Lena, moving with the heavy, sluggish gait of a girl who had forgotten the meaning of the word excellence. Victoria Ashbourne began her day not with a sunrise, but with a strategy. Inside her penthouse, the city of glass and steel below was still shrouded in a gray, morning mist, but her world was already illuminated by the cold, uncompromising glow of recessed LED lighting. She stood before her floor-to-ceiling mirror, a silent judge of her own reflection. For Victoria, getting dressed was an act of war, a daily ritual of assembling an impenetrable armor that signaled to the world that she was beyond the reach of chaos, fatigue, or failure. She reached for the navy silk suit draped across a velvet hanger. The fabric was heavy and substantial, the kind of material that didn't just hang but commanded the space around it. As she pulled on the trousers and fastened the jacket, the silk felt cool against her skin, a tactile reminder of the distance she had placed between herself and the friction of the common world. Each button was a tiny, reinforced fortress of gold. Each seam was a testament to a precision that she demanded from herself and everyone in her orbit. To Victoria, a stray thread was more than a nuisance. It was a symptom of a collapsing standard. Then came the jewelry, the final, glittering layers of her defense. She reached into a velvet-lined drawer where her collection lay arranged with mathematical exactitude. She selected a pair of sapphire and diamond earrings that caught the light with a sharp, predatory glint. As she fastened them, she didn't see ornaments. She saw symbols of a life constructed through sheer, unyielding willpower. She added a gold watch to her wrist, its steady, rhythmic ticking a pulse that matched her own calculated heartbeat. She spent a final moment at her vanity, pulling her hair back into a sleek bun so tight it seemed to sharpen the very angles of her face. She applied a muted, expensive lipstick, her gaze fixed on her own eyes that had long ago traded warmth for clarity. She saw a woman who had never allowed herself the luxury of a tired day, a woman who believed that if one's appearance was flawless, one's life would follow suit. Picking up her structured leather tote, Victoria felt the familiar weight of her own expectations. She was ready to descend into the city, a sculpture of navy silk and ice, prepared to encounter a world that she viewed as a series of problems waiting for her correction. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, the standard of gold she carried so proudly would encounter a reality that no amount of armor could protect her from. The automatic doors of the harvest basket hissed open, and Victoria Ashbourne stepped into the fluorescent hum of the grocery store, her presence a jarring note of perfection against the backdrop of mundane commerce. She moved with a calculated grace, her navy silk suit shimmering under the harsh lights as she selected a single bottle of expensive mineral water and a carton of organic berries. To Victoria, this stop was merely a box to be checked, a minor logistical necessity before her afternoon board meeting. She steered her cart toward the checkout lanes, her eyes instantly seeking the path of least resistance, the line that promised the highest level of efficiency. She chose lane 4, where Lena Morales stood like a ghost behind the register. Victoria checked her gold watch, the steady ticking of the seconds amplified by the impatient tapping of her stiletto on the linoleum. Ahead of her, the line moved with an agonizing, leaden sluggishness. Victoria's gaze drifted to the young woman behind the counter, and her disapproval sharpened into a cold, clinical focus. Lena's movements were not rhythmic. They were erratic, jerky, and heavy with a visible, suffocating fatigue. Her hair was falling in limp strands from a messy bun, and her pale face was etched with the kind of deep-seated exhaustion that a single night's sleep could never touch. As Victoria finally reached the front, she placed her items on the belt with a sharp, deliberate sound. Lena didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the glowing register screen, her eyelids fluttering as if she were fighting the very pull of gravity. Her hands, small, trembling, and stained with the faint blue ink of 1,000 receipts, reached for the berries. But as she dragged the carton across the glass scanner, her grip faltered. The red laser flared, and a double chirp echoed through the quiet lane. The error message flashed on the screen in a bright, accusatory crimson. Lena stared at it for a heartbeat too long, her brain seemingly unable to process the simple correction required. She reached out to void the item, but her fingers slipped again, accidentally triggering a price check that froze the entire terminal. For Victoria, the world didn't just slow down, it stopped. The air in the lane grew thin and pressurized. She felt the heat of a familiar, righteous fury rising in her chest, not because of the lost minute, but because of the lack of discipline it represented. To Victoria, that trembling hand was a white flag of surrender, a sign of someone who had allowed life to get the better of them. She leaned forward, her sapphire earrings catching the light like jagged ice, her voice dropping to a whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Is this the extent of your professional capability?" Victoria asked, her words precision tool to cut. "Or are you simply waiting for the world to apologize for your inadequacy?" Lena finally looked up, her hollowed eyes meeting Victoria's frozen stare, and for a second, the silence between them was a chasm that no amount of gold could ever bridge. The silence following Victoria's question was heavy, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of the checkout scanners and the distant, rhythmic beep of other lanes. Lena didn't blink. She couldn't. She looked like a bird caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The manager, a man named Miller, who wore a tie that had seen better decades, began to hurry over, sensing the atmospheric pressure drop. But Victoria raised a single, manicured hand, a gesture so sharp it seemed to sever the very air. "No, stay where you are," Victoria commanded, her voice not rising in volume, but gaining a terrifying, crystalline density. She turned her focus back to Lena, whose hands had dropped to her sides, hanging like dead weight against the green polyester of her uniform. "Look at this line, Lena," Victoria said, her gaze sweeping over the cluster of shoppers who had begun to go still, their baskets forgotten. "You see people who have worked, who have planned, who have contributed. And yet, the gears of their lives are ground to a halt because you cannot find the fortitude to perform a task a machine could do with its eyes closed." She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive French perfume clashing with the store's smell of floor wax and cardboard. "I see it in your eyes, that glazed look of self-pity. You think you're tired. You think the world owes you a slower pace because you stayed up too late or lived too loosely. But exhaustion is not an excuse, it is a confession. It is a confession that you have no respect for the time of those who have actually built something." Lena's chin trembled, a single tear tracing a path through the paleness of her cheek, but she remained silent. "The tournament of ice," continued, each word falling like a shard of frozen glass. Victoria spoke of standards, of the sanctity of the transaction, and of the moral decay that began with a single double-scanned item. She didn't just critique Lena's work, she dismantled her character, painting a portrait of a girl who was a liability to progress itself. "You are not just a slow cashier," Victoria concluded, her sapphire earrings shivering with the force of her conviction. "You are a symptom of a culture that celebrates mediocrity. And I refuse to be a patron of your failure." She reached out and snatched the carton of berries from the belt, her movements a blur of navy silk. "Keep your errors. I'll find a lane where the staff hasn't already given up on themselves." As Victoria turned and began her staccato march toward the exit, she left Lena standing in a vacuum of shame. The girl looked smaller than she had moments ago, her shoulders folding inward as if trying to disappear into the very linoleum. Victoria didn't look back. She was already calculating her next move, unaware that her sermon had just condemned a saint. The manager, Miller, stepped into the vacuum left by Victoria's retreating figure, his face a mask of weary conflict. He looked at the line of silent, judging customers, then back at Lena, who remained frozen behind the register. The red light of the scanner continued to blink, a rhythmic, digital heartbeat that felt like a countdown to an inevitable end. Miller took a breath, his hand resting briefly on the counter. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but one of surrender. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a closing door. "Go home. You're clearly not fit for the floor today. We can't have these kinds of scenes in front of the regulars." Lena didn't argue. She didn't explain that she had been awake for 38 hours, or that the loose living Victoria accused her of was actually a night spent monitoring a sibling's fever. She simply reached out with a numb hand and signed out of the terminal. The machine let out a sharp, final beep, cutting her off from the only income that stood between her family and the street. She untied her green apron, folding it with the meticulous, trembling care of someone handling a shroud, and placed it on the counter. Victoria sat in her parked sedan, the engine idling with a low, expensive purr. She watched through the tinted glass, her hands still gripped tightly around the steering wheel, her knuckles white beneath her rings. She told herself she was staying to ensure the manager followed through, to see that the standard was upheld. When the automatic doors finally slid open, Lena emerged, looking smaller than ever without the structure of the uniform. The sky had finally broken, and a cold, relentless rain began to wash over the pavement. Lena didn't have an umbrella. She didn't even have a jacket. She simply bowed her head against the onslaught, her shoulders slumped forward under a weight that Victoria still refused to name. As Lena stepped onto the sidewalk, the rain instantly soaked through her thin shirt, plastering it to her frame. She didn't run for cover. She walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, her feet dragging slightly as she headed toward the bus stop at the edge of the district. Victoria watched the girl's silhouette blur through the streaks of water on her window. Lena's slumped shoulders were the last thing visible before she turned the corner and disappeared into the gray veil of the storm. Victoria shifted the car into gear, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had won the confrontation, yet as she pulled out into the street to follow that retreating shadow, she felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver that no climate-controlled interior could soothe. The hunt had begun, but for the first time in her life, Victoria Ashbourne wasn't entirely sure who was the predator and who was the prey. Victoria's sedan trailed the bus like a silent, predatory ghost, its wipers clearing the windshield with a rhythmic, clinical precision that mirrored her own mounting obsession. She watched through the veil of rain as Lena stepped off the bus 3 miles away, in a part of the city where the glass towers gave way to rusted fire escapes and crumbling brick. Victoria's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She told herself she was looking for the punchline to a joke she already knew, the confirmation that Lena lived in this squalor because of the same sluggish spirit she had displayed at the register. She slowed her car to a crawl, keeping a safe distance as Lena trudged down a side street where the streetlights flickered with a dying yellow pulse. The girl didn't look back. Her head was bowed, her wet shirt clinging to her shivering frame. Finally, Lena turned into the narrow courtyard of an apartment complex that looked like a stack of forgotten crates. The mortar was weeping, and the windows were patched with mismatched shards of plywood and duct tape. Victoria parked at the curb, the engine's low hum the only sound in the desolate street. Victoria stepped out of the car, her stiletto heels sinking into the mud of a neglected planter. She felt the cold rain immediately ruin the armor plating of her navy silk suit, the dampness seeping into the expensive fabric, but she didn't care. She was driven by a cynical, burning need to see the interior of Lena's failure. She followed the girl into the dimly lit hallway, where the air smelled of stale grease and damp concrete. The walls were scarred with graffiti and peeling paint, a visual representation of a world that had long ago stopped trying to be beautiful. Victoria reached the second floor just as a door at the end of the hall creaked open. She pressed herself into the shadows of a recessed alcove, her sapphire earrings catching a glint of the flickering hallway light. She watched as Lena stepped inside, her movements heavy and mechanical. Victoria moved closer, her heart thumping against her ribs with a strange, unbidden urgency. She reached the door and found it slightly ajar, the hinges too warped to close properly. Through the narrow crack, she didn't see the signs of lazy living she had expected. There were no discarded bottles, no evidence of a life spent in idle distraction. Instead, she saw a room that was scrupulously clean but desperately bare. And then, the silence of the apartment was broken by a sound that made Victoria's blood turn to ice. The high-pitched, rhythmic wheeze of a medical nebulizer and the soft, excited chirping of children's voices. Victoria leaned in, her breath hitching, as she prepared to look through the window of a life she had so confidently dismantled. Victoria held her breath, the damp silk of her jacket clinging to her like a cold, shameful second skin. Through the sliver of the warped door, the apartment didn't just reveal itself, it exhaled. The air inside carried the sharp, medicinal tang of peppermint, and the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of the nebulizer Victoria had heard from the hall. Lena was no longer the sluggish girl from the checkout lane. The moment she crossed the threshold, the crushing weight that had slumped her shoulders seemed to transmute into a terrifying, luminous strength. She moved toward the center of the room, where 3 small children sat huddled on a threadbare rug, their faces lighting up like small candles in a dark cathedral. The youngest, a boy no older than 4 with a plastic mask strapped to his face, reached out with small, pale hands. Victoria watched, paralyzed, as Lena knelt on the hard floor. She didn't collapse into the exhaustion Victoria had so cruelly mocked. Instead, she gathered all 3 children into an embrace that looked less like a hug and more like a barricade. Her voice, which had been a frightened whisper in the store, was now a low, melodic hum of reassurance. She began to peel off her soaked socks, her feet blue and bruised, yet she laughed, a soft, broken sound, as she told the children a story about a silly lady who was in such a hurry she forgot how to smile. The tiredness Victoria had diagnosed as a character flaw was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective love that burned with a heat Victoria had never known in her own climate-controlled life. Lena began to tend to the boy's breathing treatment, her ink-stained fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon and the tenderness of a saint. She checked the eldest girl's homework and wiped the youngest's brow, her movements choreographed by a decade of forced maturity. Victoria leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the doorframe, her sapphire earrings feeling like leaden weights. She saw the altar Lena had built, not of gold or silk, but of sacrifice and silence. Every second of incompetence Victoria had endured at the register was a second Lena had stolen from sleep to keep this fragile world spinning. The girl wasn't failing at life. She was winning a war Victoria hadn't even realized was being fought. The high society titan felt a sudden, violent crack in the ice of her own heart as she realized she wasn't the judge in this story. She was the intruder. Victoria's gaze drifted from the children to a small, circular kitchen table that sat beneath a single, flickering bulb. It was there that the true standard of Lena's life was tallied. Spread across the scarred wood was a meticulous, soul-crushing mosaic of paper, a ledger of reality that made Victoria's corporate spreadsheets look like child's play. There were dozens of them, envelopes with windows that revealed the aggressive, red ink stamps of overdue and final notice. Victoria's eyes, trained to scan for financial liabilities, traced the numbers. Electricity, water, rent, all of them balanced on a nice edge. But it was the medical invoices that drew the most blood. They were thick stacks of itemized debt for pediatric respiratory therapy and advanced nebulizer lease, each one a mountain of thousands of dollars that a minimum wage grocery clerk could never hope to climb. Beside the bills lay a small, printed photograph, identical to the one Victoria had seen taped to the register at the store. In the sterile light of the apartment, the image was no longer a distraction or a piece of sentimentality. Victoria realized with a jolt of visceral sickness that the photo was a mission statement. It wasn't a decoration. It was the why that drove the how. Every insult Victoria had hurled at the store, every word about professional excellence and discipline, rebounded against her now. She saw a handwritten schedule pinned to the wall next to the photo. Shift 1, grocery, 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Shift 2, cleaning service, 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Shift 3, night security, 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Lena wasn't slow because she was lazy. She was slow because she was dying on her feet to keep those 3 children living. Her incompetence was actually a miracle of endurance. Victoria felt the weight of her own jewelry, the sapphire earrings suddenly feeling like hot coals against her skin. She had lectured a soldier on the cleanliness of her uniform, while the soldier was busy holding the front line. The standard of gold Victoria had spent her life polishing was nothing but dross compared to the standard of grit laid out on that kitchen table. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as they touched the doorframe, a mirror to Lena's own tremors. For the first time in 50 years, Victoria Ashbourne, the woman who had an answer for everything, found herself in the presence of a truth so absolute that it rendered her completely and desertedly silent. Victoria descended the stairs of the crumbling complex with none of the militaristic precision that had defined her arrival. Her stiletto heels, once symbols of her elevated status, now felt like precarious stilts, making her stumble as she reached the bottom floor. The rain had slowed to a persistent, icy drizzle that soaked through her navy silk suit, turning the expensive fabric into a heavy, suffocating weight. She reached the sanctuary of her sedan and pulled the door shut, the soft, expensive thud of the German engineering sealing her inside a vacuum of silence. She didn't start the engine. She sat in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering yellow street lamp that illuminated the deep gashes in the brickwork across the street. For decades, Victoria had prided herself on the clarity of her vision, yet as she looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she saw a stranger. Her gaze fell to her own lap. There, resting on the fine leather upholstery, was her structured designer tote, a bag that cost more than 3 months of Lena's rent. She looked at the sapphire rings on her fingers, the gold watch on her wrist, and the diamond earrings that had felt so essential to her armor that morning. To Victoria, these had always been the markers of a life well lived, the trophies of a woman who had conquered the chaos of the world. But in the shadow of that upstairs apartment, her treasures had turned to ash. She realized with a sickening, visceral clarity that her life had been a pursuit of acquisition, a frantic collecting of things, to fill a void she hadn't known existed. She had spent her years polishing her own importance, while a few yards away, in a room that smelled of peppermint and sickness, a girl half her age was busy, saving lives, with nothing but grit and a trembling heart. The contrast was a physical ache in her chest. Victoria had mistaken her wealth for worth and Lena's struggle for failure. She had sat in judgment of a woman who possessed a spiritual fortune Victoria couldn't even fathom. The price of a soul, she realized, wasn't found in a ledger or a bank balance. It was measured in the quiet, exhausting sacrifice of one human being for another. Tears finally broke through her frozen composure, hot and stinging as they traced paths through her expensive makeup. She reached for her phone, her fingers, for the first time in memory, shaking just as Lena's had at the register. She didn't call her assistant or her lawyer to complain. Instead, she began to scroll through her contacts, her mind racing with the names of those who could help her dismantle the standard of gold and replace it with something that could actually hold weight. She had spent 50 years building a monument to herself. She would spend the next hour making sure Lena Morales never had to choose between a sibling's breath and her own. 1 week later, the automatic doors of the harvest basket hissed open, but this time, the sound didn't signal an invasion. Victoria Ashbourne stepped onto the linoleum with a soft, muted footfall, her navy silk suit replaced by a simple knit dress that didn't feel like armor. She moved through the aisles without her usual militaristic precision, her gaze no longer scanning for flaws, but resting gently on the rhythm of the store. When she reached lane 4, she found Lena Morales behind the register. The change was not in the environment, which remained loud and fluorescent, but in the atmosphere surrounding the girl. Lena's shoulders were no longer a shelf for the world's weight. They were square and light. Her hair was still pulled back, but the messy bun felt like a choice now, not a symptom of a life falling apart. The dark circles beneath her eyes had faded into soft shadows, replaced by a clarity of gaze that Victoria found almost blinding. Between them on the counter sat a heavy cream envelope, already opened. Earlier that morning, a courier had delivered it to Lena's apartment, a letter from a blind trust stating that every overdue stamp in her life had been neutralized. The medical bills, the rent, the utility arrears, all of it had been deleted from the ledger, replaced by a scholarship fund for her siblings, and a deed to a home that didn't weep mortar. As Victoria placed a single bouquet of sunflowers on the belt, Lena looked up. For a heartbeat, the memory of the Sermon of Ice hung in the air, but Victoria didn't offer a lecture. She offered a look of profound, quiet reverence. She saw the light in Lena's eyes, a brilliant, resilient spark that had been there all along, hidden behind the fatigue Victoria had been too arrogant to understand. The scanner chirped once, a clear, singular note. Lena handled the flowers with fingers that were steady and sure, no longer trembling under the pressure of survival. There were no double scans, no errors, no apologies. "Have a wonderful afternoon," Lena said, her voice a steady melody of newfound peace. "Thank you," Victoria replied, and for the first time in her life, the words were not a social transaction, but a sincere recognition of a debt she could never truly repay. Victoria walked toward the exit, her stiletto heels no longer clicking with the staccato of a predator. She looked down at the linoleum and realized that the standard of gold was a hollow pursuit. The only wealth worth keeping was the kind that could be used to light another person's way. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she wasn't just a woman in an expensive dress. She was a witness to the quiet titans of the world, finally learning how to walk with grace in the presence of others' strength,